Walmart warns prices on essentials like bananas, car seats, and strollers will rise under Trump's tariffs, reported AP News. Retail giants from Walmart to Mattel are passing import costs to consumers, confirmed the Los Angeles Times. CFO John David Rainey admitted there's only so much any retailer can absorb. Across America, checkout lines have become battlegrounds of inflation, while Canada rallies around a Buy Canadian surge. As neighbors diverge, one question lingers. Who truly gains when tariffs turn groceries into luxury? For years, Walmart embodied the promise of affordability in North America. From Arkansas to Alberta, its sprawling stores symbolized the shared benefits of globalization. Cheap imports, reliable supply chains, and aisles filled with goods that made everyday life more accessible. Families on both sides of the border relied on Walmart's model, leveraging low-cost overseas production to keep checkout prices down. It wasn't just a retailer, it was an institution of stability woven into the daily lives of millions. But beneath the fluorescent lights, cracks began to form. As the US shifted toward protectionism, Walmart's global supply chains turned from assets into liabilities. Tariffs raised the cost of everything from electronics to toys, undermining the very principle of everyday low prices. Executives openly admitted that they could no longer fully shield consumers. Meanwhile, Canada saw an opening. By dismantling internal trade barriers and launching the Buy Canadian movement, it repositioned itself as a self-reliant alternative, encouraging shoppers to support domestic producers. What had once been a seamless cross-border retail ecosystem was morphing into two diverging paths, an American giant straining under the weight of tariffs and a Canadian economy discovering new resilience in crisis. In 2025, the Trump administration escalated its tariff war, imposing some of the steepest import duties since the 1930s. Walmart, a company built on razor-thin margins and global supply chains, became one of the earliest casualties. The White House argued that tariffs would punish foreign producers and revive domestic industry, but the math inside Bentonville told a different story. CFO John David Rainey bluntly warned there's only so much any retailer can absorb. The company announced higher prices on goods that American households considered basic necessities: bananas, children's car seats, strollers. CEO Doug McMillon confirmed what shoppers feared. Higher tariffs meant higher prices, period. Walmart attempted to cushion the blow, trimming costs and negotiating with suppliers. But PBS reported that tariffs at levels not seen since the Great Depression made inflation at checkout inevitable. Los Angeles Times echoed the same. Retail giants like Walmart and Mattel had no choice but to pass import costs directly to consumers. Electronics, toys, and imported furniture, all hallmarks of the affordable Walmart promise, were suddenly luxury items for working families. Meanwhile, economic indicators painted a bleaker backdrop. The Producer Price Index jumped 0.9% in July alone, 4 times higher than analysts expected, the sharpest rise in over 3 years. Axios noted that this wasn't just a corporate problem. Rising producer costs were flowing straight to consumers, while Washington celebrated a $30 billion haul from tariff revenue. What looked like a fiscal win for the government felt like a hidden tax on everyday Americans. Trump's rationale centered on nationalism, a belief that tariffs would coerce manufacturers to bring jobs home. But the globalized nature of Walmart's supply web, stretching from electronics factories in Asia to food imports from Latin America, meant there was no quick substitute. Instead of reinvigorating US production, tariffs throttled the very model that had allowed Walmart to dominate retail. What was pitched as protection became punishment, and shoppers across the US discovered that America First came with a hefty price tag at the register. Across the northern border, Canada read the turmoil as both a warning and an opportunity. Canadian consumers, who had long been tethered to US supply chains, braced for higher prices too. But Ottawa moved swiftly, unveiling policies that contrasted starkly with Washington's inward turn. While the US imposed barriers, Canada dismantled them. The government launched the One Canadian Economy Act, Bill C-5, in June 2025, aimed at eliminating interprovincial trade barriers that had fragmented its domestic market for decades. The Washington Post reported that this reform enabled more efficient trade between provinces, smoothing logistics for companies from food distributors to auto suppliers. Business Insider highlighted the rallying cry of Buy Canadian, which captured both patriotic pride and practical necessity. As Walmart's U.S. operations groaned under tariffs, Canadian retailers promoted domestic brands, shifting sourcing to local farms, factories, and tech firms. Financial Times called it a decisive moment. Canada was leveraging its natural resources, infrastructure investment, and fiscal reforms to build a more self-reliant economy. Analysts projected that removing internal barriers could boost GDP by as much as 200 billion Canadian dollars, a staggering figure for a country often overshadowed by its southern neighbor. The cultural shift was equally significant. In communities across Ontario, shoppers deliberately chose Canadian produce and goods, not just out of nationalism, but because the shelves were stocked differently. Retailers, including Walmart Canada, began highlighting Canadian-made items as a selling point. Ottawa doubled down with infrastructure projects, easing transportation bottlenecks and strengthening supply resilience. Instead of retreating from globalization, Canada diversified, expanding trade with Europe, Asia, and other partners while cushioning itself from U.S. volatility. The divergence was stark. While U.S. households saw strollers and electronics soar in price, Canadian consumers discovered alternatives sourced closer to home. While Trump's America collected tariff revenue, Trudeau's Canada collected political capital, showing itself as adaptable, pragmatic, and united. What began as a crisis of rising costs turned into a narrative of resilience. Canada didn't escape the pain, but it seized the chance to reimagine itself as more than just America's junior partner in trade. Yet for all the contrasts, neither side of the border could fully escape the entanglement. Walmart Canada still depended on U.S. logistics networks, and Canadian suppliers still needed access to American markets. The economies were too tightly wound, like two strands of rope fraying under different pressures. For Washington, stepping back from tariffs would mean admitting the policy had backfired, politically untenable for an administration that promised protection. For Ottawa, leaning too hard into self-reliance risked antagonizing its biggest customer. Both countries were locked into a paradox. The more they diverged, the more their interdependence showed. On the ground, the stalemate translated into unease. American families paid more for groceries and essentials. Canadian households navigated higher costs for imports still flowing through U.S. channels. Neither government could claim clear victory. Instead, the battle over tariffs exposed a deeper truth. In an era of global supply chains, no economy, no matter how large or small, can stand fully alone. North America had reached an inflection point, with Walmart's struggles serving as a powerful symbol of the shared vulnerability that tariffs had laid bare. In Toronto, grocers like Loblaws and Walmart Canada quickly felt the ripple effects. Imported goods, electronics, toys, specialty foods carried higher costs as U.S. tariffs disrupted shared supply routes. Yet, unlike in the U.S., Ottawa's reforms offered a cushion. By removing interprovincial trade barriers under the One Canadian Economy Act, local farmers in Saskatchewan could more easily sell produce in Ontario, filling shelves that once depended on imports. The Buy Canadian movement gained traction, with shoppers consciously choosing domestic brands over imported alternatives. Still, the transition was uneven. Small retailers complained about delays in sourcing certain items, and families accustomed to American-priced electronics paid more for gadgets. Canadian GDP forecasts looked brighter thanks to integration reforms, but communities tied to cross-border trade, like Windsor, carried anxiety. They knew that Canada's resilience didn't mean immunity. When the U.S. sneezes, Canada often catches a cold, and this time the virus was inflation at the checkout counter. In Arkansas, Walmart's hometown, the company's low-price promise fractured under the weight of tariffs. Executives admitted that everyday essentials were climbing beyond reach. PBS documented how strollers, car seats, and even bananas, items symbolic of affordability, were no longer shielded. For working-class families, the tax at the register became unavoidable. Suburban parents cut back on discretionary spending. Urban households relied more heavily on credit, worsening financial strain. Small businesses tethered to Walmart's vast supply network were caught in the crossfire. A toy supplier in California, dependent on imported components, struggled to maintain contracts when costs ballooned. Meanwhile, broader indicators confirmed the pain. The Producer Price Index surged 0.9% in July, its sharpest jump in years, signaling that inflation was moving through every layer of the supply chain. Washington boasted of $30 billion in tariff revenue, but ordinary Americans bore the cost. The U.S. hadn't just taxed imports, it had taxed its own people, leaving consumers and retailers to shoulder the fallout. Walmart's struggles reveal a continent split in two, an America burdened by tariffs and inflation, and a Canada reshaping itself into a more unified, resilient economy. Yet supply chains and communities remain intertwined, ensuring that neither side can fully escape the other's fate. The moment is fragile, the choices consequential. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or lose together by going it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story below.